Morning there, Tad from Marketing for Hippies, and today we're going to be answering a question about do you acknowledge where you got your content from, basically. It's a question I got from a colleague. She said, if you want to use a concept that somebody else teaches, how and when do you reference them? Do you always have to? Where's the line between stealing somebody's ideas and sharing widely known concepts? Okay, so this is a good question. Generally, I would say this: if you heard the idea from someone else, give them credit. When I teach my day-long workshops, I wonder if people are just sitting there thinking, has Tad ever had an original thought in his head? Because my whole day is just me bowing to different people from whom I heard things. For example, the Island A and Island B analogy that I share when I do my workshop. I don't do it in every video, but when I teach it for the first time to people in a workshop, I certainly acknowledge that came from Bill Barron. I don't know where he got it. Maybe he came up with it himself. But I do tend to want to acknowledge the provenance of things, where they came from. And so when I do my day-long workshop, it's that all day long. And here's some things I would say. First of all, when it's clearly theirs, when somebody else had the idea first, I would just give credit. I do close-up magic, some of you may know. And one of the things I love about the magic world is they're very good at acknowledging where a trick came from. If you learn from a magician and they're going to teach you a trick, especially if you get one of their DVDs or downloadable videos, before they introduce the trick, the ones I admire will say every version of that trick that they've come across, that they've heard of, that's happened. And in fact, as they're inventing a trick, they're asking people, is this new? Have you seen this before? And if another magician came up with the idea concurrently, because sometimes, people have the same idea simultaneously, they'll acknowledge that. If they find out that somebody put basically the same trick on the market before, sometimes magicians will remove it out of respect for the other magician and say, you know what, you got there first. And what they may do then is take it back, retool it, rethink it, and release something that's more uniquely theirs. Otherwise, they'll just defer to that. I'm very drawn to storytelling, and in the storytelling world, very common for storytellers when they introduce a story to say, here's who I heard it from. I heard this story from Jimmy Jack and Cape Breton and on this date, and they tell even the story of where they heard the story first. So I think that's all very proper in cases where it's a very clear lineage where you got it from. But then there's also this question of the commons. How much in the commons is the idea? Is this an idea that is extremely common, languaging and wording that's very common, that most people use and be familiar with? If it's a turn of phrase that everyone uses, then to me it's okay, well, that's just in the vernacular, that's part of that. But if you're inventing a new word, a new phrase, a new turn of phrase, a new something, well, then maybe that's more yours. So some things I think really just are in the cultural collective commons. And it could be, certain things certainly were the idea of a single person, but they've now become so much a part of the commons over the years, and we lose track. As is maybe properly so, after a few generations, things become, they sort of lose their roots and we don't know where they came from, and these things do happen. So sometimes you can't find, you could even look and not find it. But I think it's worthwhile to look. If something becomes a very important part of what you teach, I would be looking for where it came from. What are the historical, cultural roots of this idea? I think that's respectful. I'm a big fan of etymology. And if there's a word that let's say all of your teachings come down to respect, well, then I'd probably be doing a deep dive into the etymology of respect, of the word itself. Where does it come from? How has it changed in our understanding of it over the generations? And there's a lot you can do to honor where things come from. And I've seen people not do this. There were some folks who created a program called grief literacy. And now it's possible, because I don't know these people, that they came up with that term themselves. It's also possible they heard it somewhere else. And within 5 minutes of Googling, I found that the first, at least on the internet, the first earliest version or usage of that word I could find was from 2011, and it was Stephen Jenkinson. This program came out in 2019. and they definitely claimed to have created it. So again, I'm not saying they didn't, but I'm saying they could have found out within 10 minutes and then just give an acknowledgement. This is what it can look like. You could say, we came up with this idea of grief literacy, and then we did some search and we realized that this good man, Stephen Jenkinson, had come up with that in 2011. And we came up with the idea independently, but with all due, credit to him for having the idea first. It can sound like that. And, and of course this gets into the whole conversation about trademarking things. And, there's a traditional drink called Cider, and there was a company that wanted to trademark Cider, and I believe they lost that because it is so in the commons. It's one of these, everybody uses it already. There's a woman, Elizabeth Purvis, who has a program called Feminine Magic, and she trademarked that. I'm just not a fan of trademarking these kinds of things myself. I wouldn't do it. And of course, the reason people do it is they don't want people to rip it off. I mean, I did have somebody in the Netherlands rip off marketing for hippies. I got an email from a client, God bless her, someone in the Netherlands. She said, somebody ripped off your website. I said, what do you mean? And sure enough, marketingvoorhippies.nl was there. And she said, yes, and the about marketing for hippies page, not the person's bio, but about the business page, was my page, just literally translated directly into Dutch. So I messaged him and I said, dude, that's not cool. And God bless him, he was very good about it. He said, well, I just didn't think you'd ever come to the Netherlands. I said, I was actually thinking about coming in the next few years. And I just said, I'm not going to sue you. I don't have it trademarked, but I would win. I'd win the case on this one if I did. And, it's just, people be confused. I don't know you. I don't know your style. And when I get there, they're going to think we're together and we're not. So anyways, he took it down. I said, no hard feelings. If I ever come to Amsterdam, we'll go for beers. And a couple of years later, I was in Amsterdam, and we did go for beers. We got hammered, and we didn't even talk about it. I didn't bring it up, But I had a workshop, had about, 60 people, and guess who hosted it? Our friend. So, anyways, so these are things that I think sometimes people get too protective of, or I don't know. I wouldn't do it myself. And so then, do you use that term or not? And then, this gets very touchy because, well, you can't use it because they've trademarked it. And I would disagree. I would still think those types of things are in the commons. And, there's a whole conversation to have about that. Okay, but regardless, this harkens to the conversation about cultural appropriation. If another culture has something, to what extent should you be able to use it if it tends to be the province of that culture? So for example, with white people having dreadlocks, and there's lots of things, and this is a very thorny conversation. I'm not proposing to solve it right now, but here's what I'll say. I did write a piece, and I'll put a link to it below, about cultural appropriation, and it seems to me that a helpful way to look at this is through the eyes of goodwill, not the eyes of morality. As soon as we get lost in the eyes of morality, oh man, who's right? Because you'll have black people who say dreadlocks are okay, and black people who say it's not okay, for white people to wear them. And so then who do you listen to? Because they're both from the community that you claim to admire and want the permission from, and one's giving it and one's not. So in the case of morality, you'll find a lot of difference of opinions even within those communities. But I think if we look at through the eyes of goodwill, something else appears. So for example, if you're a white person and you have dreadlocks, because you just thought the style's cool, I want to have them, and you're walking down the street and you walk past, let's say, two black people, and they see that you have dreads. One of them might say, isn't that beautiful? And the other one might say, no, that's terrible. That's cultural appropriation. This is going to cause a fight between them, possibly. So that's just something to know. It's not saying you should do it or not, but it's good to know, it's important to know that your choice might have consequences you never even become aware of. Just your appearance on the scene, having made that choice, could initiate all these conflicts that you'll never understand happened. And so the goodwill between those people is damaged, and the goodwill between those communities can be damaged. So, okay, so let's tie some of this together. Let's say somebody has something that they share, and let's say it's either clearly theirs or it's on the line. It's definitely not in the commons. It's not something that just everyone says. You're not sure. I do think the courteous thing then would be either to ask their permission for you to use it and share it, or to acknowledge them every time. And I would say, to the extent that it's clearly theirs, to the extent that this idea is their creation, a really good approach is in order here. You know, if, for example, I have this thing called the point of view pyramid, and if I discovered that somebody else was teaching it, first of all, okay, if they were teaching it and claiming it as their own, I'd be pissed. That would not be okay with me. If they were teaching it and not crediting me, I wouldn't feel great about that. You know, that wouldn't feel good either. If they were teaching it and crediting me, I think I'd be okay. I think I'd be fine as long as they were saying where it came from. Now, but if they were teaching it, crediting me, and they'd asked me if it'd be okay if they shared it, I'd be thrilled. So maybe you can consider that different levels of it. And if you're going to ask them, you know, and this happens in the storytelling thing a lot. There was let me rewind. If you're going to ask them, a good approach is very important. There's a storyteller I know from the Aleph Sky, George McPherson, and he's had a few times where people have called him, basically, teach me everything. There's a beautiful book by Martine Prechtel called The Unlikely Piece at Kuchamakik, and if you read the chapter, The French Man Gets Everything, is a really good example of a bad approach. But George got this where somebody called him and says, hey, I hear you know a lot about this character Skia on the Aleph Sky, and basically I'd like you to give me all your notes and tell me everything. You see what I'm saying? There's no courtesy in that kind of approach. There's no generosity. There's no acknowledgement of what it took for him to learn all that. So if you're going to make an ask of somebody, there are a few things to consider. One, consider giving them a gift. Consider sending them something. Some acknowledgement, some, you know, physical something in the mail. This is very common in the storytelling world. If you're going to ask a storyteller for a story, you might give them something very precious to you for that story. You know, a holy man in my community gave me this bracelet, and that story that you shared is such beautiful medicine. I'm wondering if you would entrust that story with me and help me learn it in such a way that I could bring it back, and it would be helpful and healing for my people. And I'd like to offer you this bracelet, you know, as my way of acknowledging this. Yeah. So that's a real proper thing to do. And here's some other thoughts. You might want to articulate all the reasons they shouldn't do it, because that has them feel like you really get the stakes. You could say, look, you spent all these years learning this, and you came up with this idea. You wove together this beautiful blanket of notions and ideas and concepts into something that can keep people warm in the world, and so much labor. And here I am asking you to entrust that to me, but maybe I don't know how to care for a blanket properly, and maybe I'll be careless with it. You know, this could happen, and I could imagine you'd be so concerned about entrusting this one into the care of somebody you don't know, who might misrepresent it, you know, state it badly, tell the story poorly, and ruin it. And I could understand all the reasons you wouldn't want to do that. You see what I'm saying? You can acknowledge that those things could come to pass. And again, you could acknowledge everything that went into it for them to learn it. And if you do that, you acknowledge what it cost them to get it. You acknowledge the potential consequences of all the bad things that could happen if they were to entrust it with you, and you were to give them gifts. People feel so honored and much more likely to say yes and be very happy about it. So, taking the idea, claiming it as your own? No. There's an article below linked to when Vicki Robin wrote about that's just plagiarism. No. Using the idea and not acknowledging it, that's a little bit better. using the idea and acknowledging it better, but getting permission from the source, if there is one source that you can find, and acknowledging and doing a real beautiful, courteous ask, that's even better. And I'll put a couple quotes below about good manner of approach. So anyways, that's a very long video, but it's a very worthy topic. Hopefully that's helpful. Take care.